Picture a child standing alone in the smoldering ruins of a battlefield, no family, no home, nothing but the clothes on their back and the weight of a shattered world on their shoulders. Now imagine that same child, years later, seated on a throne, surrounded by advisors, their name whispered with reverence across kingdoms. This isn't just a tale of survival. It's the untold story of how the most vulnerable among us became the architects of empires. Across the medieval world, orphans of war didn't just fade into obscurity. They rose, defying every odd to rewrite history. Their journeys were forged in chaos, yet they emerged as rulers, diplomats, and visionaries, turning the scars of their past into the foundations of dynasties that would last centuries. What does it take for a child, stripped of everything, to not only endure but to conquer? The answer lies in the resilience of the human spirit, a force so powerful it can transform loss into legacy. These young survivors didn't just inherit ruins, they rebuilt them into fortresses of power. They navigated courts teeming with deception, outmaneuvered seasoned rivals, and forged alliances with nothing but their wits and will. Their stories are masterclasses in leadership, each decision a thread in the tapestry of their rise. From the battlefields of Europe to the deserts of the Middle East, these orphans didn't just adapt to their new worlds, they reshaped them. And here's the most astonishing part. Their lessons echo far beyond the medieval era. In a world where adversity still tests us, their triumphs remind us that even the deepest wounds can become wells of strength. This video isn't just about history, it's about the timeless power of resilience. How did a handful of children, forgotten by fate, become the rulers who defined their ages? What secrets of survival and strategy can we uncover from their extraordinary lives? Together, we'll step into their footsteps, tracing the paths they carved from despair to dominion. Their stories aren't just relics of the past, they're blueprints for overcoming the impossible, waiting to be rediscovered. In the brutal aftermath of medieval battles, children who lost their families weren't merely left to fend for themselves. They became pieces on a political chessboard. Kings and nobles saw these orphans through two lenses, opportunity or danger. A child with royal blood, even if orphaned and destitute, still carried a claim to land or titles that ambitious rulers could exploit. Some were taken in as wards, groomed for marriage alliances or as puppet rulers. Others faced far darker fates, quietly removed to prevent future challenges to power. But what's extraordinary is how many of these children turn the tables. Take the story of Alfonso VIII of Castile, who became king at just 3 years old after his father's sudden death. Surrounded by scheming regents and rival nobles eager to control his throne, he survived assassination plots and civil wars, eventually reclaiming full authority in his teens. His reign would later be remembered as one of the most prosperous in Castilian history. Then there's Tamar of Georgia, orphaned early and raised in a court of ruthless power players. She didn't just survive, she became one of the greatest monarchs of her era, expanding her kingdom's borders and championing arts and culture. These stories reveal a harsh truth. Medieval society had no real safety net for orphans, especially those of noble birth. They were thrust into a world where bloodlines meant everything, yet their survival depended on sheer adaptability. Monasteries and convents sometimes took in commoner children, offering shelter but little upward mobility. For the highborn, every meal, every lesson, even every friendship could be a calculated move in someone else's game. Yet against these odds, the most resilient didn't just play the game, they rewrote the rules. What separated those who vanished into obscurity from those who climbed to power? Often, it was mentorship, a shrewd guardian, a loyal knight, or even a rival's momentary mercy could provide the tools to navigate this cutthroat world. But just as crucial was the ability to turn perceived weakness into strength. An orphan with nothing to lose could take risks a pampered heir wouldn't dare. Their very invisibility sometimes became their greatest weapon, allowing them to observe, learn, and strike when the time was right. The societal structures meant to suppress these children inadvertently forged some of history's most cunning leaders. Far from passive victims, they mastered the art of reinvention, using their fractured beginnings as a foundation for empires. Their lives force us to rethink what it meant to be powerless in an era where every destiny was contested, and how the most unlikely figures could shape the course of nations. Monasteries and noble houses stood as unlikely oases in the storm of medieval chaos, places where a child left alone in the world might find not just shelter, but a path to extraordinary influence. For orphans of war, these institutions became crucibles where survival met opportunity. Monasteries, with their scriptoriums and libraries, offered something rare in that era, the gift of literacy. A child who could read and write held power far beyond the sword, and many orphans seized this chance with both hands. They copied manuscripts, studied astronomy and medicine, even learned the diplomatic languages of Latin and Greek. These skills turned them into indispensable advisors to kings, their voices shaping policies that would outlive them. Yet monasteries were also cages of a kind. Taking vows meant renouncing claims to land or titles, a quiet way for powerful families to neutralize potential rivals, but some orphans refused to be silenced. Take the case of Alcuin of York, orphaned during the Viking raids on England. Cloistered in a monastery, he didn't just accept his fate. He mastered theology, rhetoric, and science, eventually becoming Charlemagne's chief scholar and architect of Europe's intellectual revival. His story proves that even within walls meant to constrain, ambition could flourish. Noble households presented a different kind of chessboard. To aristocratic families, an orphaned child with royal blood wasn't just a charity case, they were a living bargaining chip. Adopting such a child could secure alliances, legitimize claims, or even provide a hostage without the mess of outright kidnapping. But some of these children played the game better than their benefactors. Matilda of Tuscany, orphaned as a young girl, was taken in by relatives who saw her as a means to control her vast inheritance. Instead, she outmaneuvered them, forging her own army and becoming the Holy Roman Empire's most formidable opponent, a woman who crowned kings and defied emperors. The constraints these children faced were very real. In noble houses, every meal was a test, every conversation a potential trap. An orphan raised alongside a lord's own children had to walk the razor's edge between gratitude and ambition. Too obedient and they'd fade into obscurity, too bold and they might accidentally fall down a staircase. The survivors learned to read rooms like scholars read books, catching whispers in the tilt of a cup, spotting danger in the pause before a laugh. They turned their outsider status into an advantage, observing court politics with the sharp eyes of those who'd already lost everything. What made these children thrive where others merely endured? First, they mastered the art of selective loyalty, knowing when to cling to a patron and when to discreetly seek new allies. Second, they weaponized their education, whether in scripture or statecraft. And crucially, they understood that in a world obsessed with lineage, knowledge was the true equalizer. An orphan with nothing but wits could rise higher than a duke's heir if they spoke eloquently enough, strategized sharply enough. These institutions, designed to control or erase inconvenient young lives, became the very platforms from which orphans launched their improbable ascents. The monasteries meant to humble them gave them pens mightier than swords. the noble houses that sought to use them as pawns found themselves outplayed by minds honed in adversity. Behind every constraint lay a hidden door, and these children became masters at finding the keys. Alfonso the Battler's story reads like something torn from the pages of an epic poem, except every unbelievable twist is true. Orphaned as a boy with his father assassinated and his kingdom in chaos, he should have vanished into the footnotes of history. Instead, he became one of medieval Spain's most ferocious warrior kings, a man whose very nickname, the Battler, hints at the relentless energy he poured into carving out a legacy from nothing. His early years were a masterclass in turning vulnerability into strength. While other nobles saw a child king as easy prey, Alfonso used their underestimation to his advantage, biding his time until he could strike back with precision. What set Alfonso apart wasn't just his skill on the battlefield, though his military campaigns would stretch Aragon's borders farther than anyone thought possible, but his genius for turning personal bonds into political power. His marriage to Arauca of Leon wasn't just a union, it was a calculated move to weave his fractured kingdom into a greater tapestry of influence. Even when that marriage crumbled amid bitter rivalries, he pivoted without hesitation, forging new alliances and doubling down on conquest. His entire reign became a testament to a simple truth. In a world where bloodlines dictated destiny, an orphan with nothing to lose could rewrite the rules. Consider the sheer audacity of his campaigns. While other rulers fortified their heartlands, Alfonso charged into the unknown, leading raids deep into Muslim-held territories that others deemed impossible to conquer. His daring capture of Zaragoza in 1120 wasn't just a military victory, it sent shockwaves across the peninsula, proving that a king who'd started with nothing could outmaneuver empires. And here's the twist, his orphanhood may have been his secret weapon. Without the weight of familial expectations or the caution bred by inherited power, he fought like a man with everything to prove because he did. Yet Alfonso's true legacy wasn't just territory won, it was the blueprint he left for how to thrive in chaos. He didn't just survive his early tragedies, he weaponized them, letting the hunger of his youth fuel a lifetime of ambition. His court became a magnet for warriors, scholars, and opportunists alike, all drawn to the energy of a king who'd turned his scars into strength. Even in failure, like his disastrous attempt to will his kingdom to the Knights Templar, he defied convention, thinking so far outside the box that contemporaries couldn't decide if he was brilliant or mad. But perhaps the most revealing detail lies in the legends that sprang up after his death. Stories circulated of a king so indomitable that his corpse, propped on horseback, led one final charge against his enemies. Apocryphal almost certainly, yet the fact that such tales persisted speaks volumes. Alfonso the Battler didn't just build a kingdom, he crafted a myth, one that cemented his place in history as the orphan who refused to be erased. His life forces us to ask, is there anything more dangerous than a person who's already lost everything and has nothing left to fear? Now, let's turn to another figure who transformed the ashes of their childhood into the foundation of a dynasty. If Alfonso was fire, our next subject was ice-cool, calculating, and just as unstoppable in her own way. From the battlefields of Aragon to the shadowed corridors of Byzantine power, the pattern holds. Those who should have been broken by fate instead bent it to their will. Matilda of Tuscany's story begins with loss but not with defeat. Orphaned at a young age during the investiture controversy, a conflict so bitter it pitted popes against emperors, she inherited not just vast lands but a political minefield. Most girls in her position would have been sidelined, married off to secure someone else's ambitions. Matilda, however, became the chess player rather than the piece. By her 20s, she was commanding armies, brokering treaties, and standing as the papacy's most formidable ally in its clash with the Holy Roman Empire. Her rise wasn't just remarkable for a woman of her time, it was nearly unimaginable. What set her apart? First, her education. Raised in a household where political intrigue was the daily bread, she absorbed lessons in strategy and statecraft alongside scripture. She spoke Latin fluently, debated theologians, and studied military tactics with the same intensity most nobles reserved for hunting. But knowledge alone didn't make her powerful, it was her ability to wield it. When Emperor Henry IV marched into Italy, intent on crushing papal resistance, Matilda didn't retreat to her castles. She turned them into fortresses of defiance, sheltering Pope Gregory VII and outmaneuvering Henry at every turn. The Siege of Canosa in 1077 became her defining moment. Henry, humiliated by excommunication, stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days begging the Pope's forgiveness. What's often forgotten is that this scene unfolded at Matilda's stronghold. She wasn't just a host, she was the architect of the emperor's surrender, proving that political theater could be as potent as any army. Her mastery of symbolism, the emperor kneeling on her land, sent an unmistakable message. Power didn't belong solely to men with crowns, yet Matilda's brilliance lay in her flexibility. When alliances shifted, she adapted without hesitation. After Gregory's death, she faced new popes with different agendas, imperial armies with fresh tactics, even betrayal from within her own ranks. Each time she recalibrated. She married twice, not for love but for strategy, dissolving one union when it no longer served her goals. She funded monasteries not just for piety, but to create networks of influence, turning monks into messengers and abbots into advisors. Every move was deliberate, every setback a lesson. Her gender, often seen as a liability, became an unexpected asset. Male rivals underestimated her until it was too late, dismissing her as a mere woman while she outmaneuvered them. She weaponized their bias, using their complacency to strike. When chroniclers of her time struggled to reconcile her achievements with their view of femininity, they resorted to calling her virile, as if only masculine traits could explain her prowess. But Matilda didn't defy expectations, she rewrote them, proving that leadership had no gender. By the time of her death in 1115, she'd cemented a legacy that defied categorization. She left her lands not to a husband or a son, but to the church, a final act of defiance against those who expected her to conform. Centuries later, Dante would place her in the celestial rows of paradise in his Divine Comedy, a nod to her enduring influence. But perhaps her greatest triumph was subtler. She demonstrated that in a world where orphanhood and womanhood were supposed to be limitations, the sharpest mind in the room could turn both into advantages. Matilda's life forces us to reconsider not just medieval power structures, but the very nature of resilience. She didn't rise despite her orphanhood, she rose because of it. The precarity of her early years forged a leader who understood that survival wasn't about clinging to power, but knowing when to pivot, when to fight, and when to let others underestimate you until the perfect moment. In an era where women were often erased from the political record, she ensured she couldn't be ignored. In the cutthroat world of medieval politics, an orphan's bloodline could be both a curse and a weapon. Noble families and rival factions saw these children not as victims to pity, but as pieces to move, living chess tokens with royal claims that could legitimize a coup, secure a border, or erase a rival's legacy. Take the tragic case of Edward V of England, one of the infamous princes in the Tower. Orphaned at 12 when his father died suddenly, he and his younger brother became instant obstacles to their uncle Richard III's ambition. Declared illegitimate through fabricated claims, they vanished behind castle walls, their fate a mystery that still haunts history. For every orphan who clawed their way to power, countless others were silenced this way, not by battle, but by the quiet cruelty of political convenience. Yet some orphans learned to play the game better than their captors. Isabella of France, sent to England as a child bride to secure peace between warring kingdoms, transformed from a pawn into a queen who orchestrated her own husband's overthrow. Her early years as a foreign hostage taught her the art of patience. She observed the weaknesses of the English court, bided her time, and when the moment came, she struck with precision. Her story exposes a brutal truth. In an era where marriage treaties were shackles disguised as silk, the sharpest minds could pick the locks. The darker the intrigue, the more ingenious the survivors became. Young Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, orphaned and crowned as a leper king, should have been an easy puppet for his regents. Instead, he turned his frailty into a shield enemies underestimated him until his brilliant tactics crushed them at Montjuic. Then there's the Byzantine Princess Anna Komnene, stripped of power after her father's death and confined to a convent. Rather than fade into obscurity, she penned the Alexiad, a chronicle so meticulously crafted that it reshaped her family's legacy for centuries. These weren't just victims of circumstance, they were alchemists, transmuting their precarious positions into influence. What separated those who were erased from those who rewrote history? Often it came down to a single mentor or moment of access. A tutor who smuggled in books, a guard who looked the other way, a rival who foolishly left a door ajar. These small fractures in the system became lifelines. But the true survivors shared a trait. They understood that in a world obsessed with their lineage, knowledge was the ultimate equalizer. Literacy, languages, even the quiet study of court gossip could be sharpened into tools. An orphan who could read a treaty could spot its loopholes. One fluent in law could challenge their own captivity. This grim dance between exploitation and agency sets the stage for an even more startling transformation. Because in the unlikeliest of places, cloistered scriptoriums, dusty chapel corners, even prison chambers, these children discovered a truth their captors never anticipated. Education wasn't just survival. It was revolution in the making. In the dim candlelight of medieval scriptoriums and the hushed halls of noble courts, a quiet revolution was unfolding, one that turned parchment and ink into instruments of power. For orphans of war and political upheaval, education wasn't merely a luxury. It was the difference between vanishing into obscurity and seizing control of their destinies. Consider the case of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, orphaned as a child and raised under the watch of Pope Innocent III. While the Church hoped to mold him into a compliant ruler, Frederick absorbed every lesson with a twist. He mastered languages, philosophy, and law, then wielded that knowledge to outmaneuver the very institution that sought to control him. His reign became a testament to the paradox of mentorship. Those who taught him to read also armed him to rebel. The most effective mentors didn't just impart skills, they ignited ambition. Take the bond between the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, and his tutor, the battle-hardened knight Sir Walter Manny. Though Edward wasn't an orphan, their relationship reveals the transformative power of guidance. Manny didn't just teach swordsmanship, he instilled a strategic mindset that would make Edward one of England's most feared commanders. For actual orphans, such mentorship was even more critical. Without family networks, their survival hinged on finding patrons who saw potential where others saw pity. A monk teaching Latin to a displaced noble child might unwittingly be forging a future diplomat. A garrison commander showing an orphaned squire how to read battle maps could be shaping the next great general. But education's true power lay in its duality. For every orphan like Frederick who used learning to challenge authority, there were others like Saint Margaret of Scotland, who turned piety into political influence. Exiled and orphaned as a girl, Margaret's deep religious education allowed her to reframe her vulnerability as virtue, eventually reforming the Scottish Church and securing her family's legacy. Knowledge didn't just fill gaps, it created new identities. An orphan fluent in canon law could negotiate with bishops. One versed in herbal medicine might become a royal physician, whispering advice into a king's ear. The policies of these orphan rulers often bore the marks of their unconventional upbringings. Frederick II's fascination with Arab scholarship led him to found the University of Naples, breaking the Church's monopoly on education. Matilda of Tuscany, educated alongside monks, later funded libraries and patronized scholars, turning her castles into hubs of intellectual exchange. Their reigns shared a common thread: policies that democratized knowledge, as if ensuring no child would face the same desperate scramble for learning they had endured. Yet mentorship's shadow side loomed just as large. For every guardian who nurtured, another manipulated. Young Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, tutored by the ruthless Reynold of Chatillon, absorbed both military brilliance and a penchant for recklessness that would later endanger his kingdom. The line between mentor and manipulator was perilously thin, a fact orphans learned to navigate with razor-sharp intuition. Those who thrived did so by distilling wisdom from their mentors while discarding their flaws, crafting leadership styles as hybrid as their educations. The legacy of these self-made rulers challenges our modern assumptions about privilege and power. In an era where bloodlines supposedly dictated destiny, they proved that knowledge could be the great equalizer. Their courts became magnets for the finest minds of their age. Their laws reflected nuanced understandings of justice, and their military campaigns often succeeded through cunning as much as force. They didn't just reclaim birthrights, they redefined what it meant to rule. And in doing so, they left a silent challenge for future generations. In a world that tries to silence the dispossessed, the sharpest weapon is the one no one can take from you: the mind. The barracks became their classrooms, the clash of steel their lullabies for orphans raised in the shadow of war. Military training wasn't just preparation, it was survival etched into their bones. Stripped of family, these children often found themselves handed over to knightly orders or mercenary companies, where their vulnerability was forged into ruthlessness. Take John Hawkwood, the English orphan who rose from obscurity to lead the infamous White Company in Italy. With no lands to inherit, he turned warfare into an art form, his tactical brilliance making him the most feared and wealthy mercenary of his age. His story reveals a brutal truth. In a world where birthright dictated destiny, the battlefield was one of the few arenas where an orphan could carve their name into history. But it wasn't just mercenaries who thrived in this crucible. Noble orphans, thrust into military tutelage, learned to wield their trauma as a weapon. Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince, though not an orphan himself, trained alongside young wards of war in his father's campaigns. These boys, some as young as 12, absorbed lessons in leadership from the saddle, their victories on the tournament grounds translating to dominance in actual combat. For those without inheritance, proving their worth in battle became the quickest path to land, titles, and the loyalty of men. The Teutonic Knights actively recruited such youths, molding them into warrior monks whose loyalty to the order replaced fractured bloodlines. What set these orphaned commanders apart was their unique blend of desperation and vision. Having lost everything, they fought with nothing to lose, yet their strategies often showed a sophistication that outmatched seasoned rivals. Consider Jan Žižka, the Czech general who, though blinded in childhood, revolutionized warfare with his wagon fort tactics during the Hussite Wars. His innovations didn't stem from traditional training, but from the adaptability of someone who'd spent a lifetime turning disadvantages into strengths. Similarly, the Armenian general Esembat Sparapet, orphaned during Mongol invasions, combined conventional tactics with guerrilla warfare, his campaigns reflecting the scrappy resilience of his upbringing. Their physical scars became badges of authority. A missing eye, a mangled hand, these weren't just wounds but proof of survival, earning them the fearful respect of their troops. The Norman warlord Robert Guiscard, who rose from obscurity to conquer southern Italy, wore his battle injuries like crowns, understanding that in a world obsessed with lineage, visible proof of courage could outweigh noble birth. This cult of the scarred leader permeated medieval warfare, where an orphan's very brokenness became their most potent symbol of command. Yet beneath the armor and accolades lay a deeper transformation. These warriors didn't just adopt armies, they built surrogate families from their loyalists, creating bonds as fierce as blood. The Catalan Company, a band of mercenaries led by orphaned adventurers, swore oaths of brotherhood that surpassed feudal obligations. Their leaders, like Roger de Flor, commanded not through birthright but through shared hardship, turning their companies into moving kingdoms that carved out territories across Byzantium. In an age where most rulers inherited their soldiers, these men earned theirs one battle at a time. Religion would soon offer another path to power, one where the sword and the cross intertwined. But before we explore how faith shaped these orphaned rulers, consider this. The battlefield gave them more than strength. It gave them a language of legitimacy that even kings couldn't ignore. When diplomacy failed, their swords spoke louder than any pedigree. When your throne rests on the shaky ground of orphanhood rather than the solid rock of dynastic tradition, divine endorsement becomes more than piety, it's political necessity. Medieval Europe's orphaned rulers didn't just wear their faith, they weaponized it, transforming whispered doubts about their legitimacy into thunderous proclamations of heavenly favor. Take Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the leper king whose affliction should have disqualified him from rule. Instead, he framed his suffering as a sacred burden, comparing his lesions to Christ's wounds and his reign to a divine test. His court chroniclers didn't just document battles, they crafted parables, portraying Baldwin's tactical retreats as acts of holy patience and his victories as miracles. But Baldwin's strategy was just one thread in a broader tapestry of sacred theater. Across the continent, orphaned rulers became patrons of the spectacular, funding cathedrals so grand they seemed to scrape heaven itself. Look at the ceiling of Palermo's Palatine Chapel, commissioned by the orphaned Roger II of Sicily, a kaleidoscope of gold and mosaic where Latin, Greek, and Arabic script intertwined. This wasn't just art, it was a multilingual billboard advertising Roger's God-given right to rule over a fractured kingdom. Churches became more than houses of worship, they were propaganda machines, their very stones whispering, "This ruler, though parentless, stands with the angels." The Crusades offered another stage for these performances. Louis IX of France, who lost his father at 12, didn't just go on crusade, he turned failure into sainthood. Captured in Egypt, his ransom nearly bankrupted the kingdom, yet he spun disaster into devotion, returning with relics instead of riches, and eventually dying on another doomed campaign. His canonization wasn't just posthumous honor, it retroactively sanctified his entire reign, proving that in medieval politics, martyrdom could be more valuable than military success. Behind these grand gestures lay colder calculations. When the orphaned Empress Matilda of England faced civil war, she didn't just rally troops, she secured papal bulls declaring her opponent excommunicated. Her contemporary, Conrad III of Germany, orphaned and initially rejected as king, waited patiently while a rival died during the Second Crusade. then positioned himself as the penitent ruler who could unite the realm. Even excommunication, typically a death knell for medieval rulers, could be reversed with enough donated gold and carefully staged public penance. The clergy weren't mere bystanders in this dance, they were co-conspirators. Bishops who anointed these rulers in lavish coronations tied their own authority to the orphan's success, creating mutual dependence. A king like Alfonso VIII of Castile, orphaned at 3, grew up surrounded by archbishops who doubled as regents, their sermons blending theology with realpolitik. Monasteries became extensions of royal chanceries, their scribes drafting laws alongside liturgies. When Tamar of Georgia needed to divorce her abusive husband, she didn't convene nobles, she assembled a synod of bishops to declare the marriage void, turning canon law into a crowbar prying open her cage. Yet this fusion of faith and power had its paradoxes. The same rulers who built monasteries also taxed them. Those who vowed to protect the church routinely appointed relatives as bishops. Frederick II, raised by popes but later excommunicated 4 times, famously quipped, "God must love money, he gives so much of it to priests." His sarcasm betrayed a deeper truth. Medieval rulers, especially those without dynastic safety nets, understood that religion wasn't just about salvation, it was about survival. Their legacies linger in the stones of pilgrimage routes and the ink of illuminated manuscripts, but perhaps their most enduring lesson is this. In an era where power demanded divine justification, the smartest rulers didn't just pray, they performed. Every relic displayed, every cathedral cornerstone laid, every tear shed at a crusader's tomb was a calculated move in the greatest game of all, convincing the world that heaven itself had chosen the unchosen. Beneath the crown jewels and polished armor, the orphaned rulers of the medieval world carried invisible burdens, scars no herald could proclaim and no chronicle could fully capture. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem's leprosy wasn't just a physical ailment, it was a constant reminder of his isolation, a king whose touch repelled even as his leadership inspired. The same hands that drafted brilliant battle strategies trembled with pain, a duality that haunted his reign. His story, like so many others, forces us to reckon with a painful truth. These weren't just political prodigies, they were survivors of profound trauma, navigating thrones like tightropes strung between brilliance and breakdown. The loneliness of orphaned rulers was a peculiar torment. Surrounded by courtiers yet trusted by none, they inhabited a paradox, the most watched people in the kingdom, yet utterly alone. Tamar of Georgia's chroniclers praised her wisdom, but her private letters reveal a woman who wept over betrayals by childhood guardians she'd once called family. Alfonso VIII of Castile, raised by regents who saw him as a pawn, developed a lifelong suspicion of advisors, trusting only his wife, a bond forged precisely because she, too, had known the sting of being used as a political tool. These rulers didn't just govern, they performed a daily alchemy, turning mistrust into statecraft. Betrayal was their recurring nightmare. For every loyal knight like William Marshal, who protected the young Henry III of England, there were a dozen nobles waiting to exploit vulnerability. The Byzantine Emperor Basil I, kidnapped as an orphan and sold as a stable boy, never forgot his early humiliation. Even after seizing power, he slept with a dagger under his pillow, a habit that likely saved his life during multiple assassination attempts. The psychological toll manifested in stark ways. Some rulers, like Richard the Lionheart, became reckless in battle, as if daring fate to finish what their childhood tragedies had started. Others, like the Holy Roman Empress Agnes, retreated into piety, building convents as much for refuge as for salvation. Yet perhaps the heaviest burden was the weight of legacy. These weren't just individuals rebuilding their lives, they were resurrecting dynasties from ashes. Every decision carried the ghostly pressure of dead ancestors and unborn heirs. Frederick II, raised as a papal ward, spent his reign locked in a vicious cycle, defying the very church that had sheltered him, yet craving its validation. His obsession with legal codes and imperial titles wasn't just ambition, it was the orphan's desperate attempt to codify a belonging he'd never truly felt. Similarly, Matilda of Tuscany's relentless campaigns to reclaim her father's lands weren't mere territorial disputes, they were a daughter's lifelong elegy. The miracle isn't that some of these rulers faltered, it's that so many thrived despite the fractures. They turned their vulnerabilities into governing philosophies. Baldwin's physical suffering made him unusually merciful to prisoners. Tamar's experiences of betrayal led her to establish unprecedented rights for women in inheritance laws. Alfonso's childhood instilled a hatred of factionalism that propelled Castile toward unity. Their reigns remind us that leadership isn't forged in perfection, but in the alchemy of transforming pain into policy. What emerges from these hidden struggles isn't just a more human portrait of medieval power, it's a revelation about resilience. These rulers didn't overcome their pasts, they integrated them, weaving their orphanhood into the fabric of their rule. The very qualities that made them vulnerable, hypervigilance, adaptability, a hunger for belonging, became the tools with which they rebuilt shattered dynasties. Their greatest triumph wasn't on battlefields or in treaties, but in the quiet, daily defiance of allowing trauma to mean something beyond itself. And in that defiance, they left a legacy far more enduring than any crown, proof that even the deepest wounds can become wellsprings of strength. Restoring a dynasty from the brink of extinction required more than courage. It demanded a kind of genealogical alchemy, turning scattered remnants into unbroken lines of power. Consider the case of Henry VII of England, a man who entered this world as Henry Tudor, an orphaned exile with a tenuous claim to the throne. His father died before his birth, his mother barely 14 when she bore him, and his lineage through an allegedly illegitimate branch of the royal family was contested at best. Yet through a combination of battlefield victory and meticulous marriage alliances, he didn't just seize the English crown, he resurrected the entire Tudor line, binding the fractured wounds of the Wars of the Roses. His union with Elizabeth of York wasn't just romance, it was political necromancy, stitching together the warring houses of Lancaster and York into a single, unshakable dynasty. But Henry's strategy was just one thread in a broader tapestry of revival. Across Europe, orphaned heirs turned marriage contracts into acts of resurrection. In Spain, Isabella of Castile, left vulnerable after her brother's suspicious death, transformed her union with Ferdinand of Aragon into the cornerstone of a unified kingdom. Their marriage didn't just merge two crowns, it birthed a new Spain, one that would dominate the globe. Similarly, the Lithuanian Grand Duke Vytautas, orphaned during his family's bloody feud with the Teutonic Knights, used his sister's marriage to the Polish king to forge an alliance that would eventually break the Knights' grip on the Baltic. These weren't just weddings, they were strategic resurrections, breathing life into lineages that should have vanished. Adoption became another powerful tool in this delicate art of dynastic CPR. In Byzantium, where bloodlines were often as fluid as politics, Emperor Justinian I, an orphaned peasant's nephew, was adopted by his uncle Justin and groomed for power. Together, they didn't just preserve a family name, they revived the entire Roman Empire in the East, their legal reforms echoing for centuries. Even in Japan, the Ashikaga shoguns routinely adopted talented orphans into their line, ensuring that military genius, not just birth, could sustain their rule. These acts of legal kinship were more than kindness. They were calculated maneuvers to inject fresh strength into waning bloodlines. Yet some orphans bypassed diplomacy entirely, forcing the world to recognize their legitimacy through sheer dominance. Take Skanderbeg, the Albanian prince orphaned and raised as a hostage by the Ottomans. He didn't negotiate his way back to power. He escaped, abandoned Islam, and reclaimed his homeland through guerrilla warfare so effective it stalled the Ottoman advance for decades. His very name, a fusion of Iskander, Alexander, and Beg, Lord, was a defiant declaration. An orphan could become a legend. Likewise, the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, born after his father's assassination, turned his court into a Renaissance powerhouse, using art and education to prove that his line, though born in violence, deserved to endure. What unites these stories is a paradoxical truth. Being stripped of family often made these rulers more obsessed with legacy, not less. Without the safety net of living parents or siblings, they became hyper-aware of their role as the last link in a chain. Every decision, from the battles they fought to the children they named, was filtered through this existential imperative. Alfonso VI of Leon, orphaned as a boy, didn't just reconquer Toledo from the Moors. He styled himself Emperor of all Spain, a title that hadn't been used in centuries, as if to stretch his lineage backward and forward simultaneously. Their methods hold startling relevance today. In business, politics, even personal reinvention, their playbook adaptability, strategic alliances, and the audacity to redefine oneself remains timeless. They teach us that resilience isn't just about enduring loss. It's about rewriting the narrative of that loss into one of revival. An orphan's greatest revenge against fate isn't survival, but making sure their story doesn't end with them. And in that refusal to vanish, they gifted the world something extraordinary. Dynasties that should have been footnotes became empires. A child with no parents might seem powerless in the cutthroat world of medieval politics until you consider the staggering leverage of a well-negotiated marriage. For orphaned nobles, a wedding ring could be mightier than any sword, transforming them from vulnerable outsiders into central players on the geopolitical stage. Take the case of Constance of Sicily, orphaned as an infant and shuffled between regents like a bargaining chip. Her marriage to Henry VI of Germany didn't just secure her safety, it fused the Sicilian and Holy Roman crowns, creating an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. This wasn't romance, it was high-stakes alchemy, turning the raw material of bloodlines into unbreakable power. But Constance's story was no outlier. Across Europe, orphaned rulers turned marital alliances into diplomatic masterstrokes. The Spanish Princess Berengaria, left parentless as a teenager, leveraged her union with Alfonso IX of Leon to broker the Treaty of Valladolid, ending decades of Iberian infighting. Her brilliance lay in the details. The treaty didn't just declare peace, it stipulated that future conflicts would be resolved through arbitration, not bloodshed. In one stroke, she weaponized her marriage to institutionalize diplomacy, proving that orphans didn't just join alliances, they redesigned the very rules of engagement. The most cunning of these rulers treated marriage contracts like chess moves, anticipating consequences generations ahead. When the orphaned Margaret of Denmark wed Håkon VI of Norway, she didn't just unite two crowns, she laid the groundwork for the Kalmar Union, a Nordic superstate that would dominate Scandinavia for over a century. Her secret, she insisted their son Olaf be raised in Denmark, ensuring his loyalty to her homeland over his father's. This subtle clause in the marital terms became the thread that wove three kingdoms together, demonstrating how orphaned rulers often thought in centuries, not just seasons. Yet these alliances were never simple transactions. They required a delicate balance of coercion and charm, particularly for orphans entering hostile courts. The Byzantine Princess Theodora, orphaned during the Fourth Crusades chaos, was married off to a rival Bulgarian ruler to secure an uneasy truce. But instead of resigning herself to being a political hostage, she converted her husband to Orthodox Christianity, swayed his policies toward Byzantium, and ultimately became the power behind his throne. Her triumph reveals a hidden truth. Orphaned brides and grooms often possessed an uncanny ability to navigate foreign courts precisely because they'd spent lifetimes adapting to new environments. The ripple effects of these unions redrew maps in ways that still resonate. The marriage of the orphaned Jadwiga of Poland to Lithuania's Grand Duke Jogaila didn't just create a personal union, it Christianized the last pagan realm in Europe, shifting the continent's religious axis. Similarly, the union between Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, both shaped by childhoods marred by political instability, didn't merely unite Spain, it bankrolled Columbus's voyage, altering global history. These weren't just weddings, they were tectonic events with orphaned rulers as the unseen architects. What set these strategic marriages apart from typical noble unions? Necessity bred innovation. With no family to dictate terms, orphaned rulers negotiated from a unique position, both desperate for stability and unencumbered by traditional allegiances. They pioneered clauses about military support, inheritance rights, and even divorce terms that would make modern prenuptial agreements blush. The Armenian queen Zabel, orphaned at 6 and married off to a rival prince, inserted a provision allowing her to annul the marriage if he failed to defend her kingdom, which she ruthlessly invoked when he hesitated against Mongol invaders. Her contract wasn't just a document, it was a blueprint for survival in a world where love mattered less than leverage. The true legacy of these marital machinations lies not in the battles they won, but in the systems they built. Orphaned rulers didn't just marry for personal gain, they institutionalized their hard-won stability. The pragmatic sanction, forged by the orphaned Emperor Charles VI to ensure his daughter Maria Theresa's succession, became the cornerstone of Habsburg power for generations. Likewise, the marital treaties of the orphaned Eric of Pomerania wove the Hanseatic League into a commercial powerhouse that dominated Baltic trade for 200 years. Their greatest gift to history wasn't territory or treasure, but the fragile art of turning temporary alliances into enduring structures. In the end, these rulers redefined what it meant to be family in the medieval world. Without parents to arrange their futures, they became architects of their own dynasties, crafting bonds that transcended blood and reshaping the political landscape one strategic union at a time. The maps they altered weren't just parchment and ink, they were testaments to the audacity of those who refused to let orphanhood dictate their destiny. The flames of rebellion often burned brightest in the hearts of those who had lost everything. Orphaned leaders didn't just join revolts, they ignited them. Take Wat Tyler's Peasants' Revolt in England, where the orphaned firebrand John Ball became the voice of the voiceless. A priest stripped of his parish for radical sermons, Ball preached that no man was born with a saddle on his back, nor others booted and spurred to ride him. His words, sharpened by a childhood of displacement, crystallized the fury of thousands. When the rebellion reached London, it wasn't just about taxes. It was a seismic challenge to the very idea that birthright dictated destiny. Ball's fate, hanged, drawn, and quartered, was meant to terrify future dissenters. Instead, his legend became a rallying cry, proof that even the most broken among them could shake the foundations of power. But orphaned rebels weren't confined to peasant uprisings. In the Byzantine Empire, the teenage general Thomas the Slav, orphaned during Arab invasions, turned his outsider status into a revolution. Claiming to be the long-lost Emperor Constantine VI, he rallied an army of fellow displaced warriors and nearly toppled the throne. His audacity lay in his deception. By weaponizing the empire's obsession with dynastic legitimacy, he exposed its fragility. Though ultimately crushed, his revolt revealed a truth that haunted rulers for centuries. An orphan with nothing to lose could exploit the gap between a regime's myths and its realities. What set these figures apart wasn't just their rage, but their ability to channel it into strategy. The Hussite leader Jan Žižka, blinded as a child and orphaned by war, didn't merely fight the Holy Roman Empire, he reinvented warfare itself. His peasant armies, armed with farm tools and fortified wagons, humiliated knightly cavalry. Žižka's tactics reflected his life, improvisation born of scarcity, resilience forged in loss. His movement wasn't just a rebellion, it was a declaration that the marginalized could outthink the mighty. Even in death, his followers hollowed out his skin to make a war drum, turning his body into a cymbal that kept beating long after his heart stopped. The line between hero and rebel blurred most dramatically in the story of Skanderbeg. Torn from his Albanian family as a boy and raised as an Ottoman janissary, he might have become a loyal servant of the Sultan. But when the chance came, he defected, reclaimed his Christian identity, and forged a guerrilla resistance that held off the Ottoman advance for decades. His genius lay in turning his intimate knowledge of the enemy against them, using Ottoman tactics to ambush Ottoman troops. To his people, he was a saint; to the Sultan, a traitor. Skanderbeg's rebellion forced a question that echoes through history. Is loyalty to the hand that feeds you, or to the blood you've never known? Yet not all orphaned rebels fought with swords. In the quiet corners of monasteries, some waged subtler revolutions. The theologian Peter Abelard, orphaned young and cast into the church, used his pen to challenge the very authorities who sheltered him. His explosive debates about logic and faith, conducted in Latin but felt in the streets, proved that ideas could be as dangerous as armies. When his love affair with Heloise ended in castration and exile, his writings on personal ethics became a different kind of rebellion, a claim that even the powerless had a right to define their own morality. What united these disparate figures was their refusal to accept the roles assigned to them. Peasant or prince, monk or mercenary, they shared a conviction that the world that had orphaned them owed them something more. Their rebellions, whether on battlefields or in lecture halls, forced societies to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, power, and who got to decide what was sacred. In an era where order was maintained through rigid hierarchies, they were the wild cards, the ones who'd already tasted the worst the world could offer and fought back with nothing left to lose. Their legacies challenge us to rethink medieval justice not as a fixed system, but as a battleground where the rules themselves were contested. When an orphan like Joan of Arc could hear divine voices and lead armies, or a cast-off like El Cid could sell his sword to both Christians and Muslims, it revealed the cracks in the medieval worldview. These rebels didn't just want a seat at the table, they wanted to prove the table could be overturned. And in doing so, they reminded the powerful of a truth they often forgot, that those with no stake in the present order are the most dangerous players of all. Now consider the aftermath of these rebellions, because for every orphan who toppled a throne, there were dozens whose uprisings were crushed. Yet even in failure, their stories took on lives of their own, morphing into ballads and folktales that kept their ideals alive. The medieval world knew how to silence rebels, but it never quite figured out how to erase them. Empty treasuries made for short reigns, a truth every orphaned ruler learned fast. When Baldwin IV inherited Jerusalem's throne as a leper king, he didn't just face invading armies, he confronted vaults stripped bare by his predecessors. His solution, a radical overhaul of trade tariffs, squeezing every ounce of profit from pilgrim routes while exempting Venetian merchants to secure their naval support. This wasn't just economics, it was survival calculus where every coin weighed against the kingdom's fragile future. But Baldwin's ingenuity paled beside the financial daring of Frederick II. Crowned Holy Roman Emperor as an orphan child, he turned Sicily into a fiscal laboratory, his secret weapon, a state monopoly on grain exports, forcing European cities to pay premium prices for Sicilian wheat. He taxed Jewish moneylenders not out of prejudice but pragmatism. They were the medieval equivalent of investment banks, and Frederick knew squeezing them too hard would snap his credit lines. His ledgers reveal a ruler who understood money's flow like a general studies battlefields. Control the supply routes, and you control the war. The most ruthless fiscal strategists often emerged from the ashes of personal loss. Tamar of Georgia, orphaned by her father's assassination, didn't just rebuild her treasury, she reinvented it. Her silver mines in the Caucasus became economic engines, but her masterstroke was the salt trade. By controlling the wells along the Black Sea, she turned a humble mineral into geopolitical leverage, forcing neighboring kingdoms to negotiate or face shortages. Meanwhile, her tax collectors accepted payments in kind grain, horses, even armor, then resold them at markup, creating a self-funding cycle that kept her armies fed without draining gold reserves. Plunder wore many disguises in these rulers' hands. When Alfonso VIII of Castile needed funds to reconquer Toledo, he didn't just raid Muslim caravans, he licensed the raids. Knights who joined his campaigns kept 1/5 of seized goods, while the crown took the rest, turning holy war into a franchised looting operation. Yet even he recognized the limits of theft. His later reign saw groundbreaking treaties with Jewish and Moorish financiers, securing loans to rebuild what his wars had shattered. The numbers whisper startling truths. Records from Matilda of Tuscany's estates show her doubling iron production by offering miners profit shares, a medieval version of employee stock options. Byzantine orphan Queen Irene's tax rolls reveal how she slashed military budgets to fund orphanages, betting that long-term stability mattered more than short-term defenses. These weren't just balance sheets, they were blueprints for reinvention, where rulers who'd lost everything rewrote the rules of wealth. What united them was a visceral understanding that gold bought loyalty when bloodlines couldn't. The orphaned Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, fighting civil wars since childhood, paid his knights in silver melted from church relics, a sacrilege that horrified clerics but kept his army in the field. His ledgers show the grim arithmetic of survival. Better to anger God tomorrow than lose the throne today, yet the true genius lay in their long games. Ferdinand and Isabella, both shaped by childhoods of financial insecurity, didn't just fund Columbus's voyage, they insisted on royal monopolies over any discovered trade routes. Their contracts turned exploration into a perpetual revenue stream, proving that the best orphaned rulers thought in generations, not fiscal years. Their accounts, preserved in Seville's archives, still bear the marginal notes where Isabella calculated risks like a merchant queen, proof that the finest medieval minds understood what modern economists rediscover daily. Crisis breeds innovation, and those who start with nothing often see value where others see only ruin. A throne built on battlefield grit wasn't enough. These orphaned rulers knew true power demanded beauty as much as steel. Take Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, whose childhood as a papal pawn left him obsessed with crafting an intellectual legacy that would outshine his turbulent reign. His court in Sicily became a dazzling crossroads where Arab mathematicians debated Jewish astronomers under frescoed ceilings. while his own treatise on falconry blended science and poetry so elegantly it remained a standard text for centuries. This wasn't just patronage, it was alchemy, transforming the trauma of his orphaned youth into a cultural golden age. The same impulse drove Tamar of Georgia to commission the Vardzia Cave Monastery, its 13 levels carved into cliff faces like a divine labyrinth. Here, amid biblical frescoes and hidden libraries, scholars preserved ancient texts while scribes penned chronicles that recast her as a second King David. Every mural of her victories, every hymn composed in her honor, served dual purposes, glorifying God while ensuring no one forgot who'd made such glory possible. Even her enemies couldn't resist the pull of her cultural gravity. Persian poets who'd cursed her armies still begged invitations to her famed literary salons. But the most cunning patrons understood that art could be warfare by other means. When Alfonso X of Castile, orphaned young and nearly overthrown by his own nobles, ordered the compilation of the Cantigas de Santa Maria, he wasn't just collecting hymns. These lavishly illustrated songs, blending Moorish melodies with Christian lyrics, became sonic propaganda, portraying Alfonso as the Virgin Mary's chosen champion. The manuscripts circulated through European courts, softening his image as a battle-hardened warlord into that of a pious scholar king. Meanwhile, his legal code, the Sayat Partidas, wove Roman law with poetic justice, ensuring his influence would outlive his battles. Architecture became another language of legitimacy. The orphaned Byzantine Emperor Justinian, born a peasant's nephew, erected Hagia Sophia not just as a church but as a cosmic statement. Its dome, wider than any in existence, declared that his line touched heaven itself. Centuries later, Mehmed the Conqueror, who lost his father at 12, would kneel in that same building after taking Constantinople, instantly converting it into a mosque to signal his divine mandate. These weren't mere buildings, they were stone manifestos proclaiming that those without dynastic pedigree could still reshape civilization's skyline. The written word proved equally potent. Christine de Pizan, orphaned when her father died penniless at Charles V's court, didn't just write, she weaponized parchment. Her City of Ladies, penned in defiance of medieval misogyny, became Europe's first feminist manifesto, its allegorical towers built from the stories of history's forgotten women. That it was dedicated to another orphan, Margaret of Burgundy, reveals the quiet network of displaced intellectuals who sustained one another. Even in exile, their ink flowed like underground rivers, carving channels future generations would follow. What's startling is how calculated this cultural explosion truly was. The Hospitaller Grandmaster Jean de la Valette, orphaned during the Crusades, and later the savior of Malta from Ottoman invasion, didn't just rebuild his island fortress. He imported Italian artists to decorate its chapels with frescoes of the siege, ensuring every visitor would see his triumph through his eyes. Similarly, the Ethiopian Emperor Zara Yacob, who spent his childhood hidden in monasteries after his father's assassination, filled his court with illuminated gospels depicting his divine visions, blending mysticism with statecraft so seamlessly that rebels hesitated to challenge a man who claimed direct conversations with angels. The artifacts left behind, whether Alfonso's star charts or Tamar's golden reliquaries, whisper a unifying truth. These rulers understood that culture was the one conquest time couldn't erase. They'd seen dynasties toppled, cities burned, and names forgotten. So they planted gardens in the ruins, knowing that while swords rust and crowns tarnish, a perfectly tuned verse or a sunlit mosaic could outlast empires. Their greatest rebellion against oblivion wasn't fought with armies, but with the quiet persistence of beauty. The glittering promise of power often masked the knife waiting in the dark, especially for orphaned rulers who climbed too fast or trusted too deeply. Take the tragic tale of Edward V, the 12-year-old King of England who vanished into the Tower of London with his younger brother. Their uncle Richard, the very man sworn to protect them, declared them illegitimate and seized the crown. The boy's fate remains one of history's coldest whispers, a reminder that blood ties could strangle as easily as they sustained. Edward's story wasn't unique. It was the brutal norm for orphans who reached for thrones without the steel to hold them. Ambition itself could become a fatal flaw. Conradin, the last heir of the mighty Hohenstaufen dynasty, inherited nothing but his family's enemies and a name too heavy for his 16 years. Raised in exile after his father's execution, he marched into Italy to reclaim his birthright with the reckless passion of youth, only to be captured and publicly beheaded by his rival Charles of Anjou. His death wasn't just a political execution, it was theater designed to extinguish hope. The crowd reportedly wept as the golden-haired boy knelt at the block, his very innocence making his fall a cautionary tale about the cost of clinging to legacy. Even the most brilliant strategists could misread the board. In Byzantium, the orphaned Emperor Michael III survived regents and plots only to be murdered by his own protege, Basil, a stable boy he'd plucked from obscurity and crowned as co-emperor. The dagger strike came during a drunken feast, a grim punchline to Michael's fatal mistake, believing gratitude could outweigh ambition. Their twisted bond echoes through history, a masterclass in how mentorships could curdle into betrayals when power was at stake. Some failures stemmed from refusing to adapt. King Richard II of England, orphaned young and raised as a pawn in noble factionalism, never shook his childhood habit of relying on favorites. His courtiers' corruption alienated the very lords who'd once supported him, until his cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile to depose him. Richard died starving in Pontefract Castle, his final lesson one he'd ignored too long. Loyalty bought with titles was as fragile as parchment in flame. The cruelest irony, many fallen orphans were undone by the very traits that once saved them. Joan of Arc's visionary certainty, the force that rallied France against England, hardened into recklessness after her king's coronation. She ignored warnings, charged into Burgundian traps, and was sold to the English for 10,000 livres. Her trial and burning exposed the hollowness of divine favor when earthly alliances shifted. Even saints, it seemed, needed patrons. Yet from these ruins rise sharper lessons than any victory could teach. Conradin's doomed march shows the peril of nostalgia. Michael III's murder reveals the volatility of manufactured loyalty. Edward's disappearance warns against assuming protectors' benevolence, while Richard's fall illustrates how childhood survival tactics can become adult liabilities. Their collective tragedies sketch a map of medieval powers, fault lines, places where even the most resilient orphans found the ground crumbling beneath them. Perhaps the most haunting takeaway isn't about their individual failures, but about the systems that demanded them. In a world where lineage dictated legitimacy, orphaned rulers occupied a liminal space, too royal to ignore, yet too vulnerable to respect. Their stumbles remind us that medieval power wasn't just about skill or courage. It was about constantly proving you belonged in a club whose rules were written to exclude you. For every Tamar or Alfonso who outplayed the game, there were dozens who learned the hardest truth of all. Sometimes survival wasn't a matter of making the right moves, but of being born into the right hands. Their stories don't end with morals, but with questions. What might Edward have become had his uncle's ambition not swallowed him? Could Conradin's charm have won him a throne in peacetime? The silence where answers should be is itself an epitaph, one that whispers how thin the line was between legend and oblivion. History has a way of turning flesh and blood rulers into something more, mythic figures polished by time until their rough edges gleam like gold. The orphaned kings and queens we've followed didn't just shape their own eras. They became the clay in the hands of storytellers, molded into archetypes that transcended centuries. Skanderbeg, the Albanian warrior who defied the Ottomans, wasn't just a military genius in the annals, he became a Balkan folk hero. His childhood captivity spun into tales of divine providence, his guerrilla tactics exaggerated into superhuman feats. The man who once negotiated truces was recast as an avenging angel, his sword blessed by saints. This wasn't mere exaggeration, it was alchemy, transforming tactical retreats into moral victories and political marriages into cosmic destinies. Consider Joan of Arc's metamorphosis from disgraced heretic to patron saint. The historical Joan, a pragmatic commander who dictated stern letters to English generals, faded behind the Joan of legend, the radiant maiden who heard celestial voices. Chroniclers erased her battlefield mud and chainmail, dressing her in symbolic white. Even her failures were reframed. Her capture wasn't betrayal but martyrdom, her pyre not an execution but a portal to sainthood. The messy reality of an orphaned peasant girl leading armies became a parable about faith triumphing over circumstance, her humanity sacrificed to make her a mirror for every generation's ideals. The most fascinating distortions often hid in plain sight. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor who sparred with popes and kept a menagerie of exotic animals, was alternately painted as the Antichrist or the wonder of the world, depending on who told the tale. Muslim chroniclers, intrigued by his fluency in Arabic, wove stories of him sneaking into Jerusalem disguised as a pilgrim. Christian scribes, furious at his negotiations with sultans, accused him of Islamic sympathies. The real Frederick, a complex ruler who valued science as much as power, got lost in the noise, reduced to either demon or demigod but never simply a man. Folklore's greatest trick was turning political strategy into divine intervention. Matilda of Tuscany's calculated defense of Pope Gregory became, in later tellings, a miracle where angels bolstered her castle walls. Baldwin IV's leprosy, a source of lifelong agony, was reinterpreted as a mark of God's favor, his suffering a shield for Jerusalem. These weren't just fanciful details, they were narrative shortcuts, simplifying messy histories into clean moral binaries. An orphan's rise couldn't be mere luck or skill, it had to be destiny. Yet some legends carried eerie kernels of truth. The Armenian king Tiridates III, orphaned during Persia's invasions, really did convert to Christianity after a surreal period of madness, but later tales turned his psychosis into demonic possession, his recovery into exorcism. The Welsh princess Gwenllian, orphaned by Edward I's conquest, became a folk symbol of resistance, her actual life as a nun eclipsed by ballads of her leading phantom armies. The line between fact and fiction wasn't just blurred, it was deliberately smudged, turning historical figures into vessels for collective memory. Why does this matter? Because these myths didn't just entertain, they shaped cultures. Skanderbeg's legend fueled Albanian nationalism for centuries. Joan's sainthood became a rallying cry for French unity. Frederick's dual portrayal as monster and genius foreshadowed Europe's love-hate relationship with strong leaders. The stories we tell about the past are never just about the past. They're mirrors reflecting the fears and hopes of those who tell them. And for orphans whose lives began in rupture, the chance to be remade in myth may have been the ultimate revenge against oblivion, a way to ensure that even if their bones turned to dust, their names would never fade. A crown weighed heavier on the heads of orphaned girls, not just from gold, but from the countless eyes waiting for them to falter. Joanna I of Naples inherited her throne at 17, surrounded by uncles and cousins who viewed her not as a queen but as a placeholder. Their letters dripped with condescension, addressing her as "dear child" while plotting annexation. What they underestimated was Joanna's education in the art of silent warfare. Fluent in 6 languages and trained in canon law by her grandfather's tutors, she didn't scream for loyalty, she bought it, strategically granting titles to minor nobles who owed everything to her. When her Hungarian cousin Louis invaded to seize her throne, she didn't lead armies. She outmaneuvered him in the papal courts, convincing Clement VI that Naples' independence hinged on her rule. Her victory wasn't marked by battlefield glory, but by the quiet click of a papal seal on her legitimacy. The Hungarian invasion revealed Joanna's masterstroke. She weaponized her femininity. While Louis's chroniclers painted her as a frivolous woman obsessed with fashion, never mind that her frivolous silks were woven with gold threads spelling out legal defenses. She leaned into the stereotype. Arriving at Avignon's papal court in gowns that shimmered like justice itself, she played the pious daughter of the church, all while her lawyers dismantled Louis's claims line by line. Her real armor wasn't chainmail but dowry contracts. She married 4 times, each union a calculated move to shore up alliances without ceding power. When her second husband proved violent, she had him assassinated, then secured absolution by funding a monastery. Joanna understood the game. In a world that called women emotional, she coldly exploited the emotional biases of men. Isabella of Castile's childhood was a masterclass in turning vulnerability into leverage. Orphaned by her father's death and trapped in her half-brother's court, she survived by making herself indispensable first as a meek pawn, then as an unignorable force. Her brother Enrique's attempts to marry her off sparked her quiet rebellion. She secretly negotiated her own marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon, ensuring the contract preserved her rights as future queen. Their joint rule wasn't a partnership but a chess match, with Isabella often moving Ferdinand like a piece. She established Europe's first all-female military order, the Order of the Hatchet, rewarding women who defended their town during a siege, proof that she recognized power came in many forms. Tamar of Georgia's nobles initially resisted her coronation, arguing women were unfit to command armies. Her response: she dressed in full armor, summoned her late father's troops, and crushed a rebellion before it began. But her lasting triumph was cultural. She commissioned the Knight in the Panther's Skin, an epic poem celebrating a warrior queen, subtly reshaping Georgian ideals of leadership. Meanwhile, in Poland, Jadwiga leveraged her sainthood in the making. Crowned at 10 after her father's death, she used her piety as political capital, donating her jewels to revive Krakow's university, later named for her, and brokering peace with the Teutonic Knights by threatening to pray publicly for their souls until they relented. These rulers shared a brutal insight: the systems designed to break them could be hacked. When the English Parliament tried to sideline the orphaned Matilda by citing her womanly weakness, she turned their sexism against them, portraying herself as England's nurturing mother, then burned Stephen's supporters' lands when they resisted. Urraca of Leon, widowed and disinherited, reclaimed her throne by exploiting the Church's own teachings, reminding bishops that disowning a legitimate heir was a sin. Their strategies varied, but the core lesson was the same. In a world that gave them no weapons, they forged their own from the scraps of expectation. The ultimate proof of their genius lies in the grudging praise of hostile chroniclers. Joanna's detractors called her the she-wolf of Naples, even as they recorded her legal victories. Tamar's enemies admitted she fought like a man, unaware they'd revealed their own biases. These weren't just rulers who overcame adversity. They were alchemists who turned the lead of prejudice into gold, and in doing so, expanded the very definition of power. Their reigns whisper a challenge across centuries: never mistake adaptability for weakness or silence for surrender. The Crusades didn't just shatter cities, they shattered childhoods, leaving behind a generation of orphans with nothing but the echoes of battle and the weight of shattered futures. Yet in that chaos, an unexpected paradox emerged. Holy war became both destroyer and deliverer. For every child left starving in the ruins of Antioch, there was another like Baldwin V, thrust onto Jerusalem's throne at 9 years old, his tiny hands gripping a scepter heavier than any sword. The Crusades were a forge, melting down old destinies and recasting them into shapes no one could predict. Take the military orders: the Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights who scooped up orphan boys and turned them into warriors of Christ. These weren't just shelters, they were factories of zeal, molding children who'd lost everything into men who'd die for an idea. A boy like Everard Despars, orphaned during the Second Crusade, could enter the Templars as a penniless novice and rise to become Grand Master, his past pain transmuted into unshakable faith. The orders gave them more than purpose. They offered a brutal kind of family where loyalty was sworn not by blood but by shared sacrifice. But the true wild cards were the royal orphans, their lives dangling between crusading idealism and cold political calculus. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem was just a boy when his leprosy diagnosis should have disqualified him from rule. Instead, his very frailty became a rallying cry, a living symbol of Christ's suffering, leading armies with bandaged hands. Then there's Conrad of Montferrat, orphaned young and raised in the shadow of Crusader kings, who turned his outsider status into an advantage. Arriving late to the Third Crusade, he seized Tyre through sheer audacity, proving that in the Holy Land, even a displaced noble could carve out a kingdom if he fought like hell and prayed louder. What's chilling is how these children internalized the Crusades' ethos. Chroniclers wrote of orphaned squires weeping not for lost parents, but for the chance to take the cross and avenge them. A boy like Alfonso of Aragon, whose father died besieging Fraga, grew up obsessed with reclaiming Spanish lands from the Moors, not as politics but as sacred duty. The line between vengeance and devotion blurred until they were one and the same. Yet the Crusades also birthed quieter revolutions. Girls like Maria of Antioch, orphaned by siege warfare, leveraged their royal blood into diplomatic power, negotiating treaties when men had failed. Others found refuge in convents where they didn't just pray. They managed estates, copied manuscripts, and quietly kept the flame of learning alive amid the carnage. The Crusades promised glory, but it was often the forgotten orphans who did the real work of holding shattered realms together. Their collective story forces us to confront the duality of holy war. It wasn't just about reclaiming Jerusalem. It was a seismic event that rewrote countless lives, offering some orphans thrones and others early graves. The true cost of the Crusades wasn't measured in battles lost or won, but in the eyes of children who learned too young that God's will could be as merciless as any sword. And in those eyes we see the most unsettling question of all. When salvation and survival demand the same price, who's left to say no? The scars of childhood lost didn't just linger, they governed. Baldwin IV's leprosy, contracted in boyhood, became the prism through which he ruled Jerusalem. His laws protecting leper colonies weren't mere charity. They were autobiographical edicts written in the language of shared suffering. When he pardoned prisoners of war or spared besieged cities from slaughter, his nobles saw weakness, but Baldwin understood what they couldn't. A king who'd spent his life in pain knew the cost of inflicting it needlessly. His reign reveals a haunting truth. Trauma could temper steel with mercy, turning a ruler's deepest wounds into their most unexpected strengths. Yet not all orphaned sovereigns responded with compassion. For every Baldwin, there was a John the Fearless of Burgundy, whose father's assassination before his eyes forged a ruler obsessed with preemptive strikes. His famous decree, "better to fear than be feared," wasn't just political theory. It was the credo of a boy who'd watched trust betray his family. The same man who funded hospitals for the poor also ordered the drowning of 3,000 rebels in the Seine, his policies swinging violently between generosity and brutality. Psychologists might recognize the oscillation of an attachment disorder, the orphan's dilemma of craving loyalty while expecting betrayal. The medieval world had no concept of trauma-informed governance, but these rulers enacted it instinctively. Tamar of Georgia's groundbreaking laws protecting peasant widows mirrored her own childhood when her mother struggled to hold their kingdom together. Alfonso VIII of Castile, who survived regents poisoning his tutors, later mandated royal kitchens employ tasters, not just for safety, but as a public reminder that his reign would never again be controlled through fear. Their edicts were psychological self-portraits painted in the ink of legal codes. Some traumas birthed institutional revolutions. Frederick II's childhood as a papal pawn left him with a lifelong distrust of clerical power. His constitutions of Melfi didn't just reform Sicilian law. They stripped bishops of judicial privileges, replacing canon courts with secular ones. The same boy who'd been dressed in monk's robes to manipulate him grew into the emperor who declared, "God needs no wealth, only men do." His entire legal philosophy reads like a rebuttal to those who'd weaponized his orphanhood against him. The darkest transformations occurred when childhood terror metastasized into paranoia. Byzantine Emperor Basil I, kidnapped and sold as a stable boy, filled his later legal codes with obsessive clauses about loyalty tests and treason by thought. His infamous decree condemning entire families for one member's crime, including infants, betrayed a man who'd never escaped the trauma of being the disposable child. Similarly, Richard the Lionheart's refusal to ransom prisoners after his Austrian captivity mirrored his own childhood abandonment by Henry II, a wound that festered into mercilessness. Yet the most revealing policies often hid in mundane documents. Matilda of Tuscany's estate records show her granting land to orphanages at triple the rate of other nobles, while Henry III of England's household rolls reveal he paid double wages to servants who'd lost parents' quiet acts of solidarity masquerading as administrative decisions. These weren't just rulers shaped by trauma. They were architects of systems that unconsciously replicated their own salvations. The parchment trails they left behind, tax exemptions for war widows, harsher penalties for betraying oaths, sudden funding surges for monastic schools form a psychological mosaic. Each law, each decree was a fossilized moment where personal pain met public policy. To read them is to witness the most intimate alchemy of power. How abandoned children, once handed the reins of empires, tried to govern the worlds that had failed to protect them. Their statutes weren't just rules, they were messages in bottles tossed across centuries, whispering how deeply the past could shape a throne. Orphaned rulers didn't just lead nations, they became them. Their fractured beginnings, once marks of shame, were polished into symbols of collective survival, their personal trials reframed as national epics. Take Serbia's Stefan Nemanja, cast out as a child during a dynastic feud, who returned to unite warring tribes under a single crown. His story of exile and triumphant return mirrored Serbia's own cycles of invasion and rebirth, turning him into a living metaphor for the nation's stubborn endurance. Centuries later, during Ottoman rule, peasants still whispered his name like a prayer, proof that an orphan story could outlast empires. This alchemy turning individual trauma into shared identity relied on careful myth-making. When Hungary's Matthias Corvinus, born weeks after his father's assassination, transformed Budapest into a Renaissance jewel, his court poets didn't just celebrate his achievements, they rewrote his origins. His childhood as a political pawn became a heroic odyssey, his scholarly pursuits reframed as divine preparation. The message was clear: if this boy could rise from ruin, so too could Hungary. His coronation wasn't just a ceremony, it was theater staged to echo the legend of the White Stag, a mythical creature said to lead the Hungarians to their homeland. By tying his story to ancient folklore, Matthias didn't just claim the throne, he embedded himself in the national psyche. The most potent symbols emerged from defeat. Scotland's Margaret, the Maid of Norway, died at 7 en route to claim her throne, her ship lost in a storm. Yet her brief, tragic life crystallized Scottish resistance to English domination. Ballads turned her into a martyr, her innocence contrasting with the brutality of feudal politics. Similarly, Portugal's Afonso Henriques, orphaned during his mother's desperate rebellion, didn't just found a kingdom, he became its eternal underdog. Chroniclers depicted him battling Moorish giants single-handedly, his victories proof that Portugal, though small, was destined for greatness. These weren't biographies, they were foundation myths with orphans as their sacred protagonists. Why do these figures still resonate? Because they embody the most powerful human narrative: redemption. A nation built by an orphan isn't just a place, it's a promise that brokenness can birth something stronger. Modern leaders still invoke them. Greece's Eleftherios Venizelos quoted the orphaned Byzantine Emperor Basil II in wartime speeches, while Romanian revolutionaries pinned images of Vlad the Impaler, whose childhood as an Ottoman hostage fueled his later brutality, to their protest banners. The orphan ruler's appeal is universal, transcending eras. They're the ultimate underdogs, proof that history doesn't belong only to those who start with advantage. Their legends persist because they answer a deep human question. How do you unite people who have known nothing but division? You give them a story where the fractured becomes whole. When Poland's Casimir the Great inherited a kingdom ravaged by his father's wars, he didn't just rebuild castles. He commissioned stained glass showing his orphaned youth as a time of divine testing. His reign became Poland's golden age, but it was the image of the boy king alone in the wilderness that truly bound his people together. In the end, these rulers understood what modern politicians often forget: that governance isn't just about laws or battles, but about giving collective pain a hero's face. Even the most brilliant dynasties forged by orphaned rulers carried the seeds of their own destruction, not in weakness, but often in the very traits that had built them. Take the Hohenstaufens, that meteoric line begun by Frederick I, an orphan raised in the shadow of his uncle's failures. For generations, they dominated Europe through sheer audacity, only to collapse when Frederick II's heirs inherited his brilliance without his restraint. Their fatal flaw, a refusal to share power. Frederick's childhood as a papal pawn left him allergic to reliance, and he groomed no successors, trusting only his own genius. When he died, the empire fractured between squabbling heirs, proving that dynasties birthed from one mind rarely survived it. External threats played their part, but the deadliest blows often came from within. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, painstakingly rebuilt by Baldwin IV's leper-crippled hands, didn't fall to Saladin's armies first. It rotted from infighting among nobles who'd forgotten the unity forged by their orphan king. Baldwin's counselors, once bound by shared awe of his suffering, became petty warlords the moment his bandaged hands turned cold. Similarly, Tamar of Georgia's golden age dissolved within decades as her descendants, raised in palaces she'd won through battle, grew addicted to luxury. The hunger that drove orphaned founders was impossible to inherit. geography conspired against some dynasties. The Armenian Reubenids, founded by an orphan prince who carved a kingdom from Byzantine collapse, flourished until trade routes shifted. Their mountain fortresses, once impregnable, became prisons when Mongol horsemen bypassed them entirely. Likewise, the Norman Hottervilles, bastard-born warriors who seized Sicily, found their Mediterranean crossroads both a strength and a curse. Their mixed Arab-Greek-Latin court, once a model of tolerance, became a target for popes and sultans alike, until the last orphan, Queen Constance, watched her life's work dissolve into Angevin conquest. Yet the cruelest unravelings came from success itself. The orphaned Habsburgs, who rose from obscurity through strategic marriages, became victims of their own blueprint. By the time Charles V inherited half of Europe, the family's obsession with bloodline purity had shrunk their gene pool to a puddle. His jaw, so deformed he could barely chew, symbolized a dynasty choking on its own obsession with legacy. Their story mirrors nature's law. Systems too rigid to adapt shatter under their own weight. What unites these falls is a tragic irony. The qualities that saved orphaned founders doomed their heirs. Baldwin's self-reliance became isolationism. Tamar's cultural fusion turned to fragmentation. Frederick's intellectual freedom decayed into arrogance. Their dynasties didn't fail because they were weak, but because they were human. And perhaps that's their final lesson. Greatness bought with pain is fleeting, but the courage to build it endures. Even in ruin, their stories whisper not all legacies need to last forever to matter. The boardrooms and battlefields of today might seem worlds apart from medieval courts, but the playbook written by orphaned rulers still holds startling relevance. Consider adaptability, their most vital skill. Alfonso VIII of Castile didn't just survive regents who poisoned his tutors. He studied their tactics, then turned their own tricks against them. Modern leaders face similar tests, industries disrupted, markets collapsing overnight. The lesson isn't just to pivot, but to absorb the environment's harsh lessons like a language. Netflix's shift from DVDs to streaming wasn't just innovation. It was Alfonso-style survival, reading the terrain before the avalanche hit. Alliance building, another cornerstone, was never about mere networking for these rulers. Tamar of Georgia didn't just marry for political gain. She crafted bonds where loyalty outlasted the wedding feast, her secret, shared purpose over short-term gain. Silicon Valley's golden handcuffs, stock options tying talent to companies, echo her strategy. But Tamar went deeper, ensuring allies benefited tangibly from her success, like granting land to loyal generals. Modern partnerships often fail because they're transactional. Medieval orphans thrived by making interdependence inevitable. Resilience, though, is where their legacy burns brightest. Baldwin IV's leprosy didn't weaken his rule, it refined it. His pain bred a rare clarity. When you've faced annihilation, petty office politics or quarterly slumps lose their terror. Entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs, who weathered exile from Apple only to return and redefine it, channeled this orphan's grit. But true resilience isn't just enduring, it's alchemizing scars into strategy. Frederick II, raised as a papal puppet, didn't just resent his handlers, he reverse-engineered their manipulation into unmatched diplomatic cunning. The modern world's volatility mirrors medieval chaos more than we admit. Startups face noble rebellions like Matilda of Tuscany's civil wars, employees or investors turning on founders. Her response, outmaneuver, never outmuscle. She let enemies overextend, then struck when they were exhausted. Corporate takeovers today follow the same rhythm, patience as a weapon. Yet their greatest wisdom was paradoxical, vulnerability as strength. Orphaned rulers advertised their rough origins not as shame but as credentials. Skanderbeg's childhood as an Ottoman hostage became proof he knew the enemy's mind. Modern leaders often hide struggles, but consider how Oprah Winfrey transformed her traumatic childhood into a narrative of empathy that built an empire. Authenticity, when strategic, disarms critics and rallies teams. The through line is mindset. These rulers didn't just overcome adversity, they weaponized hindsight. Every loss became a lesson catalogued for future use, like Baldwin studying his military defeats until he could predict enemy formations blindfolded. Modern data analytics mirrors this, turning failures into predictive algorithms. But where we rely on machines, they honed intuition through relentless reflection. Their ultimate gift was redefining power itself. For Orphans, authority wasn't inherited. It was earned through value creation. When Henry VII rebuilt England's treasury after the Wars of the Roses, he didn't just restore coffers. He instituted rigorous financial audits, medieval KPIs. Today's most enduring leaders grasp this. Influence flows to those who solve pressing problems, whether it's Elon Musk making electric cars desirable or Malala Yousafzai turning persecution into global education advocacy. The challenge they pose to us is profound. In an age of cushioned leadership and instant gratification, their lives demand a harder question. What would you build if you'd lost everything? Not just clever pivots or charismatic teams, but legacies etched into the bedrock of your field. Because the orphans of history didn't just survive their chaos, they mastered it, leaving blueprints for turning existential risk into enduring advantage. Hollywood loves a good orphan story, either the saintly ruler rising from ashes or the tyrant forged in trauma. But real medieval history laughs at these lazy tropes. Take the myth that orphan kings were all either pitiful puppets or bloodthirsty madmen. Reality, most were pragmatists who understood nuance better than chroniclers did. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem didn't let leprosy make him a recluse or a monster. He governed with startling diplomacy, once halting a siege because the enemy's civilian suffering reminded him of his own. Yet you'd never guess that from films painting him as either a holy martyr or a decaying fanatic. Another stubborn fiction, that orphan queens relied solely on seduction or saints to keep power. Tamar of Georgia's legend focuses on her beauty or piety, but her tax records tell a different tale: methodical infrastructure projects, military reforms rewarding merit over birth, and trade deals shrewd enough to make a Venetian merchant blush. Meanwhile, poor Matilda of Tuscany gets reduced to a lovesick warrior maiden in ballads, ignoring her genius for turning excommunication into a political weapon. The truth is, these women wielded bureaucracy like broadswords, their gender less a weakness than a smokescreen for rivals who underestimated them until it was too late. Then there's the tired idea that trauma inevitably twisted these rulers into paranoics. Sure, some like Byzantium's Basil I had trust issues, but compare him to Frederick II, who turned his papal upbringing into an obsession with religious debate rather than persecution. His court hosted Muslim scholars and Jewish translators not despite his orphanhood, but because its loneliness taught him the value of outsiders' perspectives. For every paranoid recluse, there was a ruler like Alfonso VIII, whose childhood as a pawn made him fiercely protective of advisors who spoke hard truths. The most pernicious myth of all, that their success was predictable, even destined. Hindsight paints Skanderbeg's rebellion as inevitable, but contemporaries saw a reckless gamble, an orphaned hostage with no army, no allies, and a price on his head. His victories weren't foreordained, they were triumphs of adaptability, like relearning Albanian after years of Ottoman captivity to rally shepherds and nobles alike. The same goes for Joan of Arc's divine mission. Conveniently forgotten is how she nearly starved before her first battle, surviving on borrowed cloaks and sheer stubbornness. Destiny makes for good poetry but terrible history. What emerges when we scrape away these fictions? Leaders who defy easy categories. Baldwin wasn't a leper first and a king second. He was a strategist who happened to be ill. Tamar didn't rule like a man or like a woman, but like someone who'd studied power since her guardians tried to steal it. Their orphanhood shaped them, yes, but didn't define them. And that's the real story, not archetypes, but human beings who turned fractured pasts into futures no one could have scripted. The orphaned monarchs of medieval history didn't just rule their own eras, they sculpted the contours of our modern world. Walk through any European capital, and you're treading on invisible footprints. The legal codes of Alfonso the Wise still whisper in Spanish courtrooms, his orphan's obsession with fairness etched into statutes. Cross the Alps, and the trade routes Frederick II secured between Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire now hum with trucks instead of mules, their economic DNA unchanged. These rulers didn't just leave behind castles and chronicles, they built systems so resilient that wars, revolutions, and time itself couldn't erase them. Consider how deeply their personal scars shaped enduring institutions. Baldwin IV's leprosy wards in Jerusalem evolved into the hospice movement that pioneered modern palliative care. Tamar of Georgia's laws protecting peasant widows became the blueprint for social safety nets across the Caucasus. Even their failures birthed progress. The financial audits Henry VII imposed after his turbulent rise later inspired double-entry bookkeeping. What began as survival tactics for rulers with no safety nets became the scaffolding of civilizations. Their cultural fingerprints are just as vivid. The vibrant polyphony of medieval choral music, thank Alfonso X's Cantigas de Santa Maria, composed by an orphan king desperate to harmonize his fractured kingdom. The Renaissance's love of classical learning, Frederick II's Sicilian court, where Arab, Jewish, and Christian scholars collaborated, set the template. These weren't just patrons of the arts, they were artists themselves, using culture as both bomb and weapon, stitching their fractured identities into the fabric of their realms. But why do their stories grip us centuries later? Because they transform historical footnotes into human sagas. When we read of Matilda of Tuscany holding her father's sword at age 6, or Baldwin struggling to grip a scepter with disfigured hands, we don't see distant legends, we recognize the universal tremors of loss and resilience. Their genius lies in the paradox. They wielded absolute power while embodying the ultimate underdog narrative. A CEO today might cling to their startup's garage origins, but medieval orphans carried theirs in every decree, every alliance, every stone they laid. Perhaps their most unexpected legacy is the quiet rebuke they offer modern leadership. In an age of short-term thinking, these rulers planted forests they'd never sit under. The Vienna woods, protected by orphaned Habsburg dukes in the 1300s, still purify the city's air today. The water systems Isabella of Castile commissioned during the Reconquista quench Spanish throats now. They governed not for quarterly reports, but for quinces, the next generation's harvest. The true measure of their impact isn't in what survived, but what transformed. The orphaned monarchs took the very thing that should have broken them, their rootlessness, and turned it into a superpower, the ability to see beyond tribe, beyond tradition, beyond the myopia of inherited privilege. When we debate immigration policy or social mobility today, we're unwittingly continuing conversations they began at candlelit council tables. Their lives whisper a challenge across the centuries. The future belongs not to those who cling to legacy, but to those brave enough to redefine it. From the ashes of battlefields, these orphans forged empires, proving that destiny isn't written at birth. It's seized by those bold enough to reshape their scars into strength. Think of Baldwin IV, his body ravaged by leprosy, yet his mind sharp enough to outmaneuver entire armies. Or Tamar of Georgia, a girl whose nobles scoffed at her coronation, only to kneel before her strategies within years. Their stories aren't just history, they're masterclasses in turning adversity into advantage, showing us that the most unbreakable crowns are those reforged from brokenness. But here's the twist: their greatest legacy isn't in the lands they conquered or the laws they penned. It's in the radical idea they embodied, that no setback is final, no disadvantage permanent. When Frederick II, raised as a puppet in papal courts, grew up to challenge the very church that groomed him, he proved that even the most controlled beginnings can birth uncontrollable brilliance. These rulers didn't just climb from ruin, they redrew the maps of possibility, leaving behind a question that echoes across centuries. What might you rebuild if you stopped seeing your struggles as obstacles and started treating them as raw materials? Consider the quiet rebellions hidden in their triumphs. Every time Matilda of Tuscany picked up a quill instead of a sword to draft a treaty, or Alfonso the Wise compiled astronomical tables while his nobles plotted, they were quietly arguing that knowledge trumps lineage. Their lives whisper that reinvention isn't about erasing your past, it's about assembling a future from its pieces. Even their failures, like Skanderbeg's unfinished war or Joan of Arc's pyre, became kindling for movements they'd never lived to see. So as the curtain falls on these tales, don't just marvel at their distant glory. Spot the threads connecting their world to yours, that project you've postponed. The doubters you face, the ruins of old plans, you're standing where they once stood on the brink of what could be, if you dare to build. Drop a comment below about which ruler's resilience resonated most, and hit subscribe for more stories where history's underdogs become its architects. Because the past isn't just a record, it's an invitation to rewrite your